As small but complex ecosystems, tropical islands face significant threats, many of which are externalities of global policy and activity, like warming ocean waters, which leads to coral bleaching, rising sea levels, which endanger coastal communities everywhere, and even the ubiquity of plastic waste washing up on the shores. A lot of the active policy and conservation projects in place are aimed at mitigating or at least delaying the effects of these issues, from coral restoration on bleached reefs, which propagates the genetic lines of the most bleach-resistant corals, to enacting policies to limit beachside and coastal construction, and enormous community efforts to clean the beaches as waste washes in. There is one issue over which our local actions have much more control, however, and it's an issue that really only presents itself fully once it's too late, and that's our local water quality. Marine environments are affected by the water quality, just like how we rely on good air quality. Our often reckless use of the ocean as dumping grounds trickles down through all levels of the trophic structure, changing the behaviors of species from the near invisible phytoplankton to sea turtles that have been nesting along the same beaches for generations. The issue of declining water quality is intricately tied to poor tourism management. Given the lure of financial incentive, operators function as a revolving door for millions of tourists annually, with little regard for the impact these tourists have, their education on interacting with the local environment, or the functional capacity of these small island ecosystems. Here on Koh Tao, we've had steadily rising numbers of tourists each year, and the rise in the number of scuba diving centers, boats, restaurants, and guest houses reflect that. These increases amplify the impacts of the water quality in areas like ours where some policies are in place but rarely followed and almost never enforced. Just this year, several dive centers on the island began to collect and test water samples weekly to establish a baseline for the water quality on the island and how that holds up against ideal metrics. Declining water quality is something not visible until it's too late, and the reef experiences mass death from eutrophication, or the lack of oxygen, and algae blooms caused by high levels of nutrients. This project is underway just as a sister island off Thailand's western coast, Koh Phi Phi, just this week made the landmark decision to indefinitely close its esteemed Maya Bay, made famous by the movie The Beach. After years of receiving millions of tourists, the bay has been experiencing heavy decline. The original plan was to close entry for 6 months, but the local unit of the Thai Department of National Parks, Wildlife, and Plant Conservation extended this closure after reviewing the progress of ecosystem recovery after just 5 months. I contacted the NWP to see what it determined as the causes for Maya Bay's decline. My awesome colleague P10 helped to translate, and the winners are improperly maintained boats leaking oils and gas, stressed mooring systems and rampant anchor dropping, thousands of liters of sunscreen containing the coral-killing chemical oxybenzone, uneducated tourists, and the runoff from nearby resorts and restaurants. Without the closure, the NWP fears conditions in Maya Bay will deteriorate to the levels seen in Boracay Island in the Philippines. This island has consistently hailed as one of the top island destinations in the world, and earlier this year the government closed the entire island permanently because of the unmanageable, constant algae blooms plaguing the coastline, a direct indicator of too much anthropogenic pressure. The issue for Koh Phi Phi now is for the local policymakers to understand how to keep this unbridled tourism from just spilling its impacts over into other nearby bays. The government has floated ideas such as controlling access to areas through e-ticketing sales, so as to attempt to control capacity, but nothing has yet firmly been set. Over on Koh Tao, the community is under pressure to learn from these lessons, but lack of enforcement of existing policy remains an issue, as does the threat of bypassing the island's tourism capacity. Our local DMCR liaison, Amon Pierre-Yapanish, here in the right-hand corner, said that the most immediate policies the local agency unit is focusing on are requiring the ferries to the island to report their ticket sales to the government, since we still only rely on estimates for official tourism figures here, and establishing a Koh office specifically to enforce runoff regulations in place for resorts and local businesses, including up-to-date sewage treatment units island-wide and proper waste management. The government agency also intends to use our data collection to help inform its decision-making and policy, which represents just how important these monitoring efforts are to ensure science meets policy. I won't go through every test we conduct. If you guys are interested, I'm happy to share more info. But we've been able to supply information, including that our local pH levels are fairly ideal, except just along the coastline. In an ideal environment, we should be reading pH levels of 8.1, while along this coast, this figure rises to 8.9, which represents possible high levels of fresh water. We have no natural fresh water source on Tau, so these levels near the shore could show how deforestation for coastal development has hindered the island's natural ability to handle freshwater rain, spilling it into the bays. Our nitrate levels are also extraordinarily high. While small quantities of nitrates are healthy for the reef, we're talking something like 1 part per million. We're seeing regular readings of 12.5 part per million and higher, linked directly to the island's problem with sewage and wastewater runoff. Happily, phosphate levels are on par with the ideal, as close to zero as possible. This is likely because phosphates are more commonly found in things like agricultural products and fertilizers, and we really don't have much farming here. The hope is that these indicators can help prioritize policies to help increase overall water quality, thereby trickling down to a better overall ecosystem health. Of the representatives I spoke with, however, no one really mentioned any education program paired with these policies. I genuinely believe most tourists are not here to destroy the ecosystem, but simply don't know the lasting impacts things like their sunscreen or handling of the reef might have. The power of suggestion can be really influential in many cases. A few months ago, I attended the Asia Pacific Coral Reef Symposium in the Philippines and went to a presentation by a researcher studying tourist interactions with the reef in Guam. Over 6 months, she dove every day recording the intentional or accidental touching of the reef by divers and snorkelers, revealing pretty troubling figures. She then distributed a short boat briefing to the dive centers participating in her study, which had the captain simply tell the divers, "Please do not touch the coral." Over the next 6 months, interactions with the reef declined by 70%. Just letting people know how easily not to destroy something totally changes their behavior towards it. Due to the long history of unmanaged tourism out here in Southeast Asia, a lot of communities are definitely on the brink of ecosystem decline. But hopefully these ecosystems, like the one on Koh Tao, aren't too far gone and can still learn from the policy gaps that have led other areas to take such drastic measures.